Before the modern motor car, people's main motive power was the humble horse, but his role was soon to diminish. In 1769, the Frenchman, Cuno, created the world's first self-propelled vehicle, a three-wheeled steam carriage with its boiler positioned ahead of the front wheel. By 1876, the first internal combustion engine had been developed by Nicholas Otto. Just 10 years later, inventor Carl Benz showed the world his new petrol-engined car, the world's first. Other companies were quick to follow suit, like Daimler in 1889 with its steel wheel model. The development of the motor car was now well underway. With this rapid development came the desire to prove what these new contraptions could do, particularly as so many people resented the motor car initially. Early trials proved good fun for those taking part, as well as helping designers in their quest for reliability. Hill climbs were also popular with those people wealthy enough to afford a car in these early years. Even so, for the majority, early cars were still a novelty. Belgian Camille Genatzi was one of the most successful early drivers, though it was the French who organized the world's first motor races run on public roads. The experience gained was invaluable, enabling manufacturers to use the race circuits as test beds. Some of the methods used in these pioneering races were rather primitive. While some countries, such as Britain, were slow to allow motor racing on public roads, over in Germany, the sport was attracting the attention of the ruling classes, and marques such as Mercedes and Porsche were achieving success on the motor racing circuits. By 1905, more organized racing was emerging, with France's Gordon Bennett Cup one of the most prestigious annual races, before giving way to the French Grand Prix series. In Germany, the Kaiser's Cup was one of that country's main sporting events. Not all contests were run against the clock. In 1905, this Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost covered a total of 15,000 miles, being driven from London to Glasgow no less than 27 times. And the only problems experienced were the occasional puncture. But the greatest thrills were clearly reserved for the circuits, where these great pre-war races provided spectacular viewing, both in Europe and here on the American dirt tracks. The cars were beginning to feature enormous engines, capable of producing for their day highly impressive power outputs and top speeds. And names like Napier, Peugeot, Mercedes, Itala and Renault were beginning to emerge as major competitors on the race circuits. The introduction of Grand Prix racing saw a new era for the sport. This, the 1908 French Grand Prix, was held at the village of Eu, near Dieppe, and was typical for the time in featuring plenty of thrills and spills to keep the crowds happy. Let's enjoy some rare, exciting motor racing from the early years of the century. Despite speeds being much lower than those of today, motor racing was actually far more dangerous, with these early cars being less than competent in terms of handling and braking.
And in the glimmer of the moonlight, they love to sing this song. I say that you like a ukulele, lady like a you. You like a single very city, ukulele, like a tune. If you kiss a ukulele lady, why you promise ever to be you? And she another ukulele lady fool along with you. Maybe she'll cry, maybe she'll cry, maybe she'll find somebody else. Sing to Paris to the city, where the chicken wicky wacky do.
Christian Lautenschlager has to have his Mercedes restarted after stalling it on a bend, but he and his mechanic are soon underway again. In these early days of uncertain reliability, an accompanying mechanic was an obligatory part of any driver's toolkit. It was only in much later years that single-seater racing cars became the norm. One of the most successful racing cars of the pre-Grand Prix era of Gordon Bennett races was produced by Napier. This particular car, with a Charles Jarreau at the wheel, crashed during the 1903 Gordon Bennett event in Southern Ireland. But it survived and is now Britain's oldest racing car. The Napier was the first car to introduce green as the colour for British racing cars. The colour that later became known as British Racing Green. This 1903 example was powered by an engine of 7.7 litres, comparatively small for such a car in those days, providing a top speed of 75 miles per hour, not bad for the turn of the century. In these idyllic pre-Great War days, many companies produced cars with enormous four-cylinder engines. The 1907 Itala, one of the first Italian cars to adopt red as that country's racing colour, possessed a 14.5-litre unit, offering a top speed of 100 miles per hour while running at a leisurely 1,100 revolutions per minute. This car won the Coppa della Velocità race at Brescia with Cagno at the wheel, at an average speed of more than a mile a minute. Not all motorsport prior to World War I involved huge engine monsters, today's equivalent of Formula One. There was a more amateur side to the sport too, featuring individuals in their cars rather than manufacturers. At this level, it was a friendly sport, with cars, trikes, motorbikes and sidecar combinations, all competing against each other in hill climbs and reliability trials. Engines became more efficient and reliable, manufacturers like Ford investing heavily in new car developments. Such development took a back seat, however, following the advent of World War I. As motor manufacturers went over to the production of military equipment during the war years, so the development of the motor car through motorsport inevitably ceased. In fact, no major motor racing was allowed in Europe until 1920. But the sudden demands for further technological progress as a direct result of the war would speed up car development in the 20s. As the horrors of war came to an end in 1918, so Europe rejoiced. The major cities of Britain and Europe were soon to be teeming with cars. The 1920s looked set to become a decade of fun, amidst a world of fashion and the increasingly popular motor car. While major motor racing was banned in Europe until 1920, it didn't take long for the more amateur side of the sport to reappear. Individuals soon got their cars back on the road and back onto the off-road tracks, where enthusiasts could come together in friendly competition without the major expense of the leading races. For spectators, these 1920s reliability trials were fascinating events, with cars, three-wheelers, motorbikes and sidecars often competing together for top honours. Even when the going got tough, these intrepid drivers undertaking a full six-day trial in the Scottish Highlands weren't deterred. The rough terrain they often encountered provided quite a challenge. It wasn't just the ups and downs that attracted the amateur drivers either. Morgans achieved great success with their three-wheelers in the 1920s, and as shown here in slightly later years, racing at Donington, with H.C. Loans establishing a lap record. These low-budget Morgan racers provided speed and excitement for the onlookers, their power and handling keeping the crowds happy and helping to establish the company's presence in the world of affordable motor racing. Once the ban on international motor racing was lifted in 1920, the rush back to the racetracks was overwhelming. The major races resumed, with the Grand Prix, a series initially started in France, now proving popular throughout the continent. And Italy's Targa Florio, almost as prestigious. The British circuit of Brooklands was also the venue for races involving relatively small cars, such as this junior cars race of 1926. Major Henry Seagrave competed in and won this event, though as a driver of some calibre, he was also highly successful in some of the grander races of the time. One of his most notable successes had been in 1923, when, at the wheel of a Sunbeam with a slipping clutch, Seagrave managed to gain an outright victory for Britain. One of the marks most often associated with 20s motor racing is that of Bugatti, whose Type 35 model of 1924 was a revelation. It was, without doubt, the most elegant racing car of its time, and its capabilities on the racetrack were equally impressive. It offered outstanding handling, arguably the first racing car to do so, and its specification included such revolutionary ideas as specially shaped wide-spoked aluminium wheels designed to conduct heat away from the tyres. Initially fitted with a 1990cc engine, the Type 35 was capable of 110 miles per hour performance. By 1926, it was being fitted with a 1.5-litre supercharged engine, before eventually growing to 2.3 litres. Although other models were produced by the company, it is Bugatti's Type 35 that is the most famous. Its racing record is impressive, for it achieved countless successes in the years 1924 to 1930. Bugattis were regularly raced at Brooklands, as this clip shows, and quickly became firm favourites with the crowds. Among the big names of Brooklands, one of the most fondly remembered is Bentley, whose supercharged models became overnight legends. Sir Henry Birkin, a successful driver of Bentleys in his own right, went a step further from the run-of-the-mill models by developing his own special-bodied version. Built in 1929, its 4.5-litre supercharged engine and aerodynamically styled bodywork came together to offer stunning performance. A top speed in excess of 130 miles per hour says it all. This car achieved a number of lap records during its successful career. The standard-bodied Bentleys achieved great successes too, both at Brooklands and elsewhere, their most spectacular win being at the 1927 Le Mans, despite the whole Bentley team being involved in a massive pile-up. In typically British fashion, the weather at Brooklands couldn't always be relied upon. But that didn't stop the dedicated throngs of race enthusiasts from enjoying themselves, and the popularity of Brooklands grew enormously. In 1929, the Irish Tourist Trophy illustrated the way in which many major races now incorporated the Le Mans type start, and crowded thoroughfares were not uncommon. Off the track, car development continued at rapid pace, with every major manufacturer now turning to mass production as a means of meeting demand and cutting production costs. Car ownership became affordable for more people. The motor industry, and with it motorsport, were in good shape. However, the good times weren't to last for long. When many major markets started to suffer a slump in the late 20s, the effects of this recession spread rapidly throughout the world. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 dealt a final cruel blow to most markets, bankrupting countless businesses and causing hardship to many. The 1920s ended on a sour note with little optimism for the future. Despite the gloomy note on which the 1920s ended, the following decade was to see further vast increases in traffic levels throughout Europe, and motor shows enabled everyone to inspect the latest models at their leisure. As racing cars developed, so did the circuits they raced on. England's Brooklands and Germany's Nurburgring were now firmly established as two of the leading race circuits, hosting many of the most important pre-World War II races. Brooklands came about as a direct result of Britain's reluctance to accept motor racing in its formative years. As racing was banned on British roads, there was inevitably a need for a custom-built race circuit. Wealthy racing enthusiast Hugh Lock-King recognized this and employed 2,000 men to clear 30 acres of woodland from his country estate in Weybridge, Surrey. Thousands of tons of cement were then used to construct the 2 3/4 miles of racetrack that became known as Brooklands. Brooklands had been officially opened on June the 17th, 1907, and was justifiably claimed to be the first purpose-built permanent motor racing circuit in the world, as well as boasting unique banking. At last, Britain had been put on the map of motor racing. Not everyone welcomed the new circuit, though. Local residents were swift to complain about the noise, and it soon became a condition of racing at Brooklands that all competing cars should be fitted with special silencers to reduce noise levels. The 1937 Brooklands Double 12 was a way of running a 24-hour race in 2 12-hour chunks, more acceptable to the locals. Although motor racing had generally become much more professional since its very early days, there was still room for the budget racers, though these MG Monteleri midgets were specially prepared for racing. It was still a pleasure to see cars of every type and every size battling it out on the racetrack at Donington, and especially on the famous banking at Brooklands. Many events at Brooklands were fairly low-key affairs in comparison with the major races being run elsewhere in Europe. But this didn't mean any less in the way of excitement. For thrills and spills, you didn't need to support an international Grand Prix. The 1930s were notable for the increasing interest in racing from women drivers, such as Psyche Altum, one of the most successful of all. Many events now featured women's classes, and the sport in general was gradually losing its purely masculine image. In the early 1930s, the Italians were the force to be reckoned with in terms of international racing success. The Alfa Romeo 8C Le Mans featured a supercharged 2336cc double overhead cam engine, producing 153 brake horsepower. The 8C went on to win the Le Mans 24 Hours race every year from 1931 to 1934, and the Mille Miglia from 1932 to 1939. With most countries developing their own racing cars by now, Britain wasn't being left behind. The pre-war racing MGs were particularly popular. the P series of the 1930s helping to establish the mark on the racetrack. In supercharged and unsupercharged form, MGs in a whole variety of guises enabled enthusiasts to go racing at reasonable cost and helped to make the MG name famous as nimble, small-engined, lightweight sports cars. Before any race, there was a chance for competitors to test their cars and themselves with a few trial runs, while mechanics busied themselves with final preparations. Until, finally, all the competitors were lined up for the start of the race. The banking at Brooklands proved its worth once again, allowing high speeds to be attained in spite of the primitive suspension. Famous British racing driver of the day, Whitney Straight, brings his Duesenberg into the pits for some rapid attention.
In her direction, oh me, oh mine, ain't that perfection?
These pit scenes alone give some indication of the resources needed by such wealthy amateurs in order to go racing. Notorious among Brooklands drivers was the Big Bump. Not only was there a real ridge in the concrete, which was only 4 inches thick in places, but the surface of the track was loose and troublesome. But it was that Big Bump that caused problems, even for drivers like John Cobb in his Railton, and problems for cars. At the end of the race, John Cobb bears the scars of flying debris from the loose Brooklands circuit. In 1898, Camille Janazzi increased the land speed record from 39 miles per hour to almost 66 miles per hour. Interestingly, the original record was actually less than the cycling speed record of the time. By 1926, Henry Seagrave had become the latest in the line of land speed record holders, posting a new high of 152 miles per hour. The following year, his 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam broke the 200 miles per hour barrier for the first time. Then, in 1929, Seagrave's Golden Arrow carried him to a new record of 231 miles per hour. Malcolm Campbell won the title several times from 1924 in the first Bluebird, clocking 146 miles per hour, and taking the later Bluebird over the 300 barrier in 1933. Let's take a look at some rare archive footage of one of Campbell's successful attempts in 1933.
Now, I would like to introduce to you my mechanics who have worked so hard in preparing this car. I can only say that I'm awfully proud to have the privilege of being associated with fellows like this, because any success which we've achieved in the past has been due in no small measure to this very gallant little band of my very loyal supporters. And what is the average speed of the mile?
The average speed is 272.108. North at 273.556. South 270.676.
Thanks very much. If anybody would like a real thrill, I suggest that they drive this old car at a speed of anything between 270 and 280 miles an hour, and they'll get a real kick, I can assure them of that.
As the 1930s progressed, so did the development of motor racing and the cars themselves. The sport was becoming noticeably more organized, and the modern racing cars of the time boasted performance and handling characteristics that would have been unheard of a few years earlier. One of the most successful of such cars was the ERA, standing for English Racing Automobiles, whose cars received much praise for their competitiveness in the 1930s. The most famous of all ERA drivers was Raymond Mays, taking the car to very many wins at hill climbs all over England. By the late 30s, it was the Germans who were the ones to beat. Their heavy investment in both Grand Prix and sports car racing enabled them to develop some outstanding new models. BMW's 328, introduced in 1936, was fitted with a 2-litre 6-cylinder engine with 3 Solex carburetors. Unusual features at the time included a rigid tubular chassis and independent front suspension. In Britain, the Fraser-Nash Company joined forces with BMW to market the cars, hence the adoption of the Fraser-Nash prefix to the BMW 328's title. As racing success became more desirable and prestigious, so governments became interested in promoting the sport for their own benefits. Motor racing was often seen as a nationalistic sport, a whole country claiming victory in a race rather than simply the winning team. Hill climbing was as popular as ever in the 1930s, though the pace had quickened considerably since the very early days. Many of the hill climbs held on the continent were quite spectacular, both from a driving and a scenic point of view. Of the international hill climbs, Mans and Monaco was one of the most demanding, with 14 miles of twisting mountain road to contend with. Many big motor racing names were now competing in hill climbs. Whitney Straight can be seen here at the wheel of his ex-Birkin Maserati, featuring a twin rear-wheel setup. Back in Britain, hill climbing was fast becoming a very popular spectator sport, attracting plenty of onlookers and plenty of competitors. Leading venues were at Shelsley Walsh, which is today the world's oldest motorsport venue still in existence, and Prescott, a beautifully located venue in Gloucestershire. Hill climbs were places where the amateur driver could take part in motorsport at minimum cost, as well as proving the capabilities of particular models. Despite their amateur status, hill climbs were quite arduous, both for the drivers and their cars. The Prescott Hill Climb has been running for many years, attracting cars and drivers from all over the country. And the cars that competed there in the pre-war days were just as desirable as those seen today. This Bugatti was really put through its paces at pre-war Prescott. By the 1960s, very many of the same pre-war cars had survived, thanks to their regular use in vintage club racing. The racing was fast and fun, but very amateur, the way it was meant to be.
Off the line with 12 laps to the checkered flag. And as they pour down through cascades, the battle is really on. Lap 2, and Jeffrey St. John leads the Sunbeam. Lodge corner, with the camera speeding things up a bit. Lap 6, the Sunbeam leads after St. John's Bugatti stopped for a drink. Ron Footit, in unmistakable style, splendidly in 4th place. Arnold Foster easing up a bit with a hot motor. And Bernard Kane stylishly through in his Bugatti. Harry Rose in his magnificent blower Bentley. The flag is unfurled, and George Burton is over the line in 1st place, with Souden's Bentley 2nd. A lap of honour for the Sunbeam after a well-driven race.
And even today, hill climbing with pre-war cars at Prescott is still as popular as ever.
And I'm going to, yes, this is interesting, tell me more. And I'm going to take the body off and hopefully put a Lynx-style body on. You want it to have
Seeing such pristine old cars still competing after all these years is a testimony to their quality and competitiveness, and is a major reason why so many of them have survived. We caught up with racing personality Rivers Fletcher at the Prescott Hill Climb and asked him what motorsport was really like in the pre-war days.
Well, of course, motor racing in England before the war was very amateur. And of course, being amateur, the drivers had to be mostly fairly well heeled because there was no sponsorship, but very exciting. Principal races at Brooklands and Donington and Crystal Palace, and wonderful hill climbs here at Prescott and at Shelsley Walsh. They were the principal speed hill climbs.
Rivers Fletcher still takes part in hill climbing at the wheel of his Alvis, a typical 1930s sports racing car.
by far the most popular type of motor racing pre the war was for smaller cars, for Austins and MGs, the Austin 7 and then the MG Midget and later Magna and Magnet. Those cars were raced all over the country, in fact all over the English-speaking world before the war, particularly at Brooklands.
Meanwhile, over in America, motorsport had a fun side to its identity by the 1930s.
This one is a stock car race. Cars built for pleasure, but it's no pleasure riding in them right now. There are plenty of thrills and a good massage for the spinal column. And when they crash, they usually call it a day. Professional auto racers take the spotlight in the annual 500-mile race at Indianapolis, Indiana. They roar around the track at breakneck speed, and woe befalls the car that skids. Again, Lady Luck mixes with misfortune. Some miraculously escape, but others bite the dust. The prize is big, but the risk is still bigger. Not to be outdone, the professional midget racers show their wares in a race that tests the skill and stamina of every intrepid driver. Danger lurks at every turn, and many come to grief as the little fellows get out of control. More thrills with the big cars as they speed like rockets around the saucer. A crash here means trouble and worse, but this is their sport, and only an overturned car can stop them. Out of control, and it looks serious. Watch that driver. He's gambling with fate, and the odds are against him. It seems impossible that he can survive. This time, he's a winner, but a bit wobbly.
Back in Europe, Grand Prix cars, seen here at Dieppe in 1933, for instance, would still draw big crowds. The excitement and atmosphere of these major races were a real attraction, bringing together enthusiasts from all over Europe. Teams' mechanics worked hard to ensure the cars were in tip-top condition for racing, although there was none of the regimented teamwork seen today. Events like this consisted of 2 heats and a final, and were a tough challenge for the drivers and their teams. In 1933, Grand Prix races were held in France, Belgium, Italy, Monaco and Spain. That year's German event being cancelled due to an economic recession. Many of the most successful Grand Prix drivers were now becoming household names, and their progress was being watched avidly throughout Europe. The many duels between Achille Varzi and his Bugatti and Alfa Romeo's Tazio Nuvolari, for instance, provided much drama, particularly at the Monaco Grand Prix of 1933, when Nuvolari's car caught fire just before the finish. Despite trying to push the car over the line before Varzi caught him, he did not succeed, and the Bugatti won the race. Other international drivers like Louis Chiron, Luigi Fagioli and George Easton rose almost to the level of stardom. But elsewhere, the recession was having its effects. Alfa Romeo retired from racing in the same year, leaving Ferrari and Maserati to pick up the pieces for Italy. Alfa's retirement was a great shame, considering the company's success in major motor racing in the previous few years. And it meant the door was being held even wider open now for the Germans to develop their own cars and take over as racetrack dominators. Here we see Louis Chiron, the driver of the Alfa Romeo seen earlier, talking with Ettore Bugatti. 1933 Le Mans continued a tradition that had begun 10 years earlier with the very first of the famous 24-hour races, the 24 Heures du Mans. The French city of Le Mans has been a centre of motor racing almost since the advent of the sport itself. The very first Grand Prix was held there in 1906, and when racing restarted after World War I in 1921, Le Mans was again the venue for the first major event. The first all-day and all-night race at Le Mans took place in 1923 amid a violent hailstorm and proved to be a particularly successful event for the French, though it wasn't to be long before the British Bentley team achieved massive success at Le Mans, boosting their reputation as producers of fine supercharged models. The great Italian driver Tazio Nuvolari achieved one of his memorable victories in 1933, partnered by Raymond Sommer, and driving the equally great Alfa Romeo in that manufacturer's last year before retirement from Grand Prix racing. Le Mans has always been a popular Grand Prix circuit with French drivers, ever since the very first event was won by Sis driving a Renault. And its reputation as one of the premier European circuits has gone untarnished ever since. Monte Carlo 1934. Number 1 Mercedes driver Luigi Fagioli joins the other drivers for their pre-race briefing. As always on this tight road circuit, racing was to be close and intense, with overtaking opportunities at a hair-raising premium. The winding public roads that hosted the race were close lined with buildings. By this time, Grand Prix regulations had been changed to limit the weight of cars in the hope of restraining top speed. For by now, Grand Prix cars were genuinely fast machines which had to be handled with extreme skill. Though of course handling and road-holding capabilities had improved along with performance, thanks to such models as the Type 35 Bugatti. Extra skill was needed on a course like that at Monte Carlo, with races run on public roads and with hazardous corners to negotiate. With many major events held on closed circuits by now, Monte Carlo stood apart for its continued use of public roads, adding greatly to the drama. The traditional Le Mans start was now a major feature, with each driver running over to his car at the start of the race. To stand a chance of a strong start in a Le Mans race, you had to be really fit. By 1937, Le Mans was experiencing the might of the new generation German racing teams. Just as Auto Union and Mercedes were now major forces to be reckoned with in Grand Prix, so BMW were making a similar impact on the sports car racing scene. 1937 Le Mans was as attractive and enthralling as it is today, proving one of the ultimate tests of motor racing stamina. It didn't always go so well for everyone, though. That year saw one of the most notable pile-ups of the 30s period, with number 30, the Riley Sprite, finishing up flat on its back, and many other cars damaged and out of the race. As always in France, the gendarmerie had to take a hand. Valiant attempts were made to get as many cars as possible back into the race, but for many, it was all to no avail. As the rain began to fall at Le Mans, it did little to deter the BMW drivers, whose cars were becoming highly respected both on and off the track for their typically German efficiency. However, mere reliability was not enough. The name Bugatti was still prominent, chalking up yet another international victory in the hands of Jean-Pierre Vimille and Robert Benmost. In Britain, the 1930s racing scene was centred around circuits like Brooklands and Donington, though Crystal Palace was also an important venue for British motor racing, shown here in a rare piece of pre-war colour footage. Lining up for Heat 1 of the Crystal Palace Cup handicap race, Raymond Mays in the ERA number R4D, with Prince Bera and George Abacassis all on the front row. Bera leading, with Raymond Mays challenging close behind. The race turns into a ding-dong tussle between these two, and although Mays breaks the lap record on the second lap, Prince Bera holds him off to come home first, with Raymond Mays in second place. But in the final, Mays gets his revenge and wins the Crystal Palace Cup for 1937. Competition between racing teams, and indeed their countries, was very intense by the late 30s, and pressure was on for the latest in high technology to be applied to motorsport. With the aid of government grants and a wealth of technical knowledge, it was Germany who scored most points in the development stakes, with the Mercedes and Auto Union Grand Prix cars proving particularly impressive. Engine development was continuing at rapid pace, and so respected was German engineering becoming that it was soon to be the envy of the world. Other countries had much to fear from the newfound competitiveness of the German racing teams. To prove that German technology really was the most accomplished in Europe, Auto Union embarked on a program of building land speed record contenders. The company's Silver Arrow, with development by Ferdinand Porsche, proving particularly successful. At the Berlin Aubus in 1934, Hans Stuck snatched a new land speed class record for Germany, achieving 217 kilometers per hour. Such success proved Germany's capabilities once and for all. Here we see a more streamlined variant making a record attempt at Lucca in Italy, mainly identifiable as an Auto Union by its rear engine layout. By 1937, designs like this were looking far into the future. The car is studied in this piece of Nazi propaganda film, coming round the heavily banked north corner of the Aubus. Over the coming years, we were to see aerodynamics play an ever-increasing role in the quest for speed. As well as their technical skills, the Germans were also experts at adapting to any situation. After Mercedes won the Tripoli Grand Prix in 1935, 36 and 38, the rules were changed to make it a race for 1.5-litre cars, knowing that Mercedes had no suitable car with which to compete. Within 8 months, Mercedes had developed an all-new 1493cc model, the W165, capable of no less than 175 miles per hour. W165s came first and second in 1939. The Germans also boasted 2 expert drivers, recognized the world over as the best in their field at the time. Rudolf Caracciola for the Mercedes team and Bernd Rosemeyer driving for Auto Union. By 1939, these 2 drivers and their cars had managed to fire the imagination of millions of enthusiasts throughout Europe. Rosemeyer started racing with NSU motorbikes, going on to be the first to gain success with Auto Union's medium-sized racing cars. He quickly became the hero of a whole new generation of racing enthusiasts, but his life was cut short when in 1938 he crashed and was killed. In his time, he had managed to bring the Auto Union name to the forefront of racing everywhere, from Cape Town to Donington Park. Caracciola's reign at the top continued right up until the outbreak of World War II. The Mercedes team still proving a major force in the world of motor racing. The success of Caracciola and his fellow countrymen helped to increase Germany's standing in the world. The great duels of the late 30s were between Auto Union and Mercedes. Once again, the Nurburgring was considered by the Nazi government as an ideal setting for yet more glorious motor racing victories. And yet it was ironic that the enormously powerful rear-engined Auto Unions were so difficult to drive that the world's very best drivers had to be called to the services of the fatherland, no matter which country they came from. It must have pleased the German powers that be that their country's racing teams had rapidly climbed the ladder of success throughout the 1930s, justifiably claiming to be the best in the world by the time the decade had begun to draw to a close. Motor racing was soon to be temporarily abandoned as the world prepared to go to war once again. And although everyone's thoughts turned away from motor racing for the duration, the enthusiasts knew the sport would be back, stronger than ever in the post-World War II years. Now, let's take another look at some of the highlights of the great years of motor racing, 1900 to 1939.
My feet won't keep still when they swing that music. A rhythm like that puts me in a trance. You can't blame me for wanting to dance. From what I understand, boy, it must be just grand. Playing a band when they swing that music, I'm as happy as I can be. When they swing that music for me, swing on them.